"Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The words struck the air like glass shattering on marble, louder than the jazz band, louder than the soft clinking of champagne flutes, louder than the whispered negotiations of billionaires standing beneath crystal chandeliers. For a split second, time froze inside the Peninsula Chicago's lavish rooftop ballroom. Every polished shoe, every diamond cufflink, every silk dress turned toward the young server holding a silver tray. Gasps rippled like a wave across the room, and even the steady hum of Lake Michigan's breeze against the glass walls seemed to pause. Before we continue, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. And if this story already has you shocked, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button, because what's about to unfold will leave you speechless. Ava Thompson didn't move. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray, steadying the glasses before one could topple, but her eyes, calm, deep, unshaken, never left Ethan Harper's. She had endured many things in life, but in that moment, she understood the weight of silence, and she carried it with dignity. Around her, the room of elite power brokers, hedge fund managers, and startup darlings became an audience to a single act of arrogance. It was supposed to be Apex Innovations' night, Ethan Harper's night, the evening he secured a $3.5 billion acquisition deal with Sullivan Capital, solidifying his position as one of the most untouchable tech CEOs in America. But with one careless, venom-laced sentence, he set in motion a downfall no one saw coming. Daniel Sullivan, seated at the head table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the shimmering horizon of Lake Michigan, remained motionless. The 68-year-old billionaire investor, known for his calm precision and ruthless logic, watched every detail unfold with unreadable eyes. No one in the room, not even Ethan, knew that the black girl, standing there, silent and steady, was Daniel's adopted daughter. Ava's last name was Thompson, but Sullivan blood ran in her heart, and Daniel had raised her to move through storms without letting the wind see her bend. Ethan, however, had no idea who he had just humiliated. He adjusted the cuff of his Armani suit, leaning back with the casual arrogance of a man who had clawed his way up from nothing and now believed himself untouchable. "Do your job and stay out of the way," he added with a smirk, his voice carrying just enough to ensure nearby tables heard him clearly. Sophia Reynolds, Apex's glamorous and calculating marketing director, stood at his side, wearing a smile as sharp as a blade. She placed a manicured hand on Ethan's arm, whispering, "Keep your focus on the pitch, not the staff," but her tone was less about calming him and more about managing optics. Across the room, Noah Carter, Ava's closest friend and fellow server, clenched his jaw, gripping his tray until his knuckles whitened. He knew Ava's story, the long shifts she worked after class, the quiet hours spent studying financial reports instead of scrolling through social media, the years she'd spent building resilience brick by brick. He also knew her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. But he could see her hands tremble just slightly, and his chest burned with anger he couldn't voice, not yet. Phones began to rise discreetly around the ballroom. Guests angled themselves as though checking emails or adjusting jewelry, but lenses were aimed, recording. One whispered, "Did you get that?" Another replied, "Oh, I got it." Within 20 seconds, a clip of Ethan Harper's insult would leave this ballroom, hitting private investor chats. Within 2 minutes, it would enter group threads across Chicago. Within 10, TikTok, X, and YouTube would catch the spark, and the fire would spread faster than Apex's PR team could smother it. But inside the room, no one breathed loudly enough to break the tension. Ava placed her tray on the nearest marble side table, straightened her posture, and spoke, quietly, evenly, deliberately. "Sir, I was simply setting your glass. If I startled you, I apologize." That was all. No tears, no raised voice, no public scene. Her calmness was louder than his insult, and everyone felt it. A hedge fund manager's wife lowered her gaze, ashamed of her husband's nervous chuckle. A venture capitalist's assistant tapped her screen beneath the table, already forwarding the clip with a single caption, "Career-ending moment?" Sophia, sensing the shift, leaned closer to Ethan. Let it go, she murmured under her breath, but he waved her off, his ego swelling under the silent stares. He raised his glass, swirling the Bordeaux inside as if nothing had happened, then delivered the dagger that made even seasoned investors stiffen. You people need better training, he said casually, sipping his wine like a man untouchable by consequences. The words landed heavy, colder than the lake breeze drifting in through the glass doors. Daniel Sullivan's fingers, resting on his crystal tumbler, curled slightly, but he didn't move. Not yet. Daniel understood that power was most effective when patient. He had seen men like Ethan before, brilliant, ambitious, but blind to the value of dignity. And he knew the market punished arrogance faster than any competitor could. Sophia scanned the room quickly, reading faces like data points. She spotted alliances fracturing in real time, a Goldman Sachs partner whispering to a JP Morgan strategist, two hedge fund managers quietly excusing themselves, a board member stepping outside to take a call. Sophia's instincts screamed danger, but her loyalty to Ethan, or perhaps her investment in his failure, kept her by his side. Noah stepped closer to Ava, placing himself subtly between her and Ethan, his voice low enough only she could hear. You okay? She gave the smallest nod, refusing to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing her falter. But inside, she felt the sting, not of his words, but of what they revealed. She had spent years watching men like Ethan from a distance, studying how they operated, preparing for the day she'd have to stand across the table from them as an equal. She hadn't expected that day to come tonight, in the middle of serving champagne. The jazz band recovered its rhythm, but the music no longer softened the air, it sharpened it, each note slicing through the room's silence. Guests exchanged glances, silent agreements forming without words. This moment would not be forgotten. Deals could survive market crashes, but reputations? Reputations shattered faster than crystal on marble. Ethan, oblivious to the unraveling threads around him, leaned back in his chair, smirk firmly in place. Relax, everyone, he said lightly, as though mocking the tension he had caused. We're here to celebrate the future. But the future was shifting beneath his feet, and he didn't see it coming. Daniel raised his glass slowly, meeting Ethan's eyes across the room for the first time that night. It wasn't a toast. It was a warning. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Harper failed to read the room. This was no longer a ballroom of celebration. It was an arena. The next move would decide everything. Ava Thompson had learned early that life didn't wait for her to be ready. Her childhood wasn't filled with luxury or rooftop ballrooms overlooking Lake Michigan. It was nights falling asleep to the hum of sirens on Chicago's South Side, mornings helping her mother, Camille, get ready for double shifts at the nursing home, and afternoons balancing homework with taking care of her younger brother. When her mother passed away at 14, Ava grew up overnight. She fought for scholarships, worked 2 part-time jobs, and earned her way to Northwestern University. Every achievement was paid for in sacrifice, sleepless nights, and a resilience forged from fire. That's where Daniel Sullivan first noticed her, not in a boardroom, but at a small diner near campus. She was 19, waiting tables after class, serving him coffee with the same focus she gave to her studies. Daniel, one of the most respected investors in the country, saw something in her, the discipline, the sharp mind, the quiet strength most overlooked. Months later, Ava accepted his mentorship, eventually becoming part of his family. Though she carried his lessons, she chose to keep her mother's last name as a reminder of where she came from. Daniel taught her everything money couldn't buy, how to read a room, how silence can speak louder than words, how power respects restraint more than noise. That's why Ava worked at the Peninsula Chicago, not for the paycheck, but to observe the elite up close, to learn how influence moved behind champagne glasses and carefully measured smiles. Ethan Harper's journey couldn't have been more different. Born in Dayton, Ohio, he clawed his way out of poverty, built Apex Innovations from nothing, and by 35, commanded a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. But success fed his arrogance. Surrounded by people too afraid to challenge him, he believed consequences were for other men. And tonight, his arrogance stood center stage. At his side was Sophia Reynolds, Apex's marketing director, sharp and calculating. She knew exactly how to manage Ethan, or, more accurately, how to manipulate him. By flattering his ego, she controlled the story without him ever realizing it. Tonight, however, Sophia stayed silent, watching Ethan's choices set fire to his future. Across the ballroom, Daniel Sullivan observed, unmoving, his expression unreadable. He watched every gesture, every word. Ethan's insult, his refusal to apologize, his casual arrogance, they told Daniel more than any pitch deck or financial report ever could. To Daniel, character outweighed numbers, and Ethan was failing a test he didn't know he was taking. Noah Carter, Ava's closest friend and fellow server, kept near her, his jaw tight with quiet anger. "Say the word," he whispered, "and we walk out." Ava shook her head. "Not yet," she said softly. She had learned from Daniel that power wasn't always in reaction, sometimes, it was in patience. Meanwhile, the ballroom shifted beneath its polished surface. Guests glanced at their phones, group chats lit up with short videos, captions like "Did you hear this? And this is going viral." Within minutes, Ethan's words were no longer confined to this room, they were out in the world, and the world was listening. Sophia leaned toward Ethan, trying to steer him back. "We need to pivot," she murmured. But Ethan brushed her off, convinced his status made him untouchable. He raised his glass and forced a smile. "Let's drink," he announced loudly, his voice ringing hollow. "To Apex, and to the future." But the future was already shifting. Investors exchanged knowing glances, partnerships wavered, and reputations cracked quietly beneath the sound of clinking glasses. Daniel's hand rested on his glass, unmoving, patient. He knew storms destroyed the unprepared. And Ethan Harper had no idea a hurricane was forming, one recorded, uploaded, and amplified beyond his control. Ava stood tall, calm, and silent. Tonight wasn't about humiliation. Tonight was about truth revealing itself. Ethan thought he had power. He didn't know yet, he had just handed it to her. The ballroom pulsed with quiet tension, the kind that makes air feel heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Ava moved carefully between tables, her tray balanced with flawless precision, but she could feel the weight of every glance following her. Clips of Ethan Harper's insult had already escaped the peninsula's walls, bouncing from one private investor group chat to another. In less than 5 minutes, the entire Chicago business circuit would know what he said. But Ethan, arrogant and oblivious, still believed he controlled the room. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, ignoring Sophia Reynolds' subtle warnings. Sophia, Apex's marketing director, wasn't smiling anymore. She'd built her career controlling narratives, turning disasters into headlines that worked in her favor. But tonight was different. Tonight, she could already see the headlines spiraling out of her control. The quiet hum of cameras lifted again as someone in the corner discreetly pressed record, this time anticipating what came next. The moment arrived faster than anyone expected. A server carrying a tray of vintage Bordeaux brushed too close to Ethan's table, and in his arrogance, Ethan shifted sharply, knocking the edge of the tray. A single glass tipped forward, deep red spilling like ink across the pristine white tablecloth, and onto Ethan's $1,000 suit. Gasps erupted around the room, sharp and hushed, as Ethan shot up from his chair, fury igniting behind his carefully practiced smirk. "Are you kidding me?" he barked, his voice louder than the jazz ensemble struggling to fill the silence. His eyes locked on Ava, though she hadn't touched the tray. "First you people don't know how to serve, and now this?" The words weren't just insulting, they were sharp, deliberate, designed to remind everyone who he thought was beneath him. Noah Carter stepped forward instinctively, positioning himself between Ava and Ethan without drawing too much attention. "Sir, that wasn't her," he began, but Ethan cut him off with a raised hand, his expression twisted in mock authority. "Stay out of this," Ethan snapped, his tone dripping with contempt. "I don't need explanations from anyone who doesn't understand professionalism." The insult was aimed broadly, but everyone knew who it targeted. Across the room, Daniel Sullivan's expression hardened, his thumb tapping slowly against the crystal stem of his glass. The measured patience in his movements was the only sign of his growing displeasure. Daniel had spent decades watching powerful men destroy themselves with their tempers, but this was a rare and unforced collapse. Ethan was digging his own grave, one careless word at a time. Sophia reached for Ethan's arm, whispering urgently, "Ethan, stop talking. We'll handle this later." But he shrugged her off, his ego feeding on the tension. He stepped toward Ava, lowering his voice but ensuring the nearby guests could hear every word. "If you can't handle the basics, sweetheart, you don't belong in a place like this." Ava stood completely still, tray lowered, spine straight, eyes locked on Ethan's. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't step back. She had been taught by Daniel years ago that silence, when used correctly, unsettles more deeply than anger. Tonight, her restraint wasn't submission, it was strategy. And it was working. The ballroom seemed to lean toward her, waiting for her response. But she gave none. The tension reached its breaking point when Ethan grabbed her wrist. It wasn't violent, but it was sharp, sudden, unnecessary, and in a room where dozens of cameras waited for a story, it was fatal. A collective gasp swept the ballroom. Noah reacted instantly, stepping forward and pulling Ava's hand free, his voice low but trembling with anger. "Don't touch her," he warned. For a moment, the entire rooftop went silent except for the distant hum of city traffic below. Phones rose higher now, openly recording. No one even pretended discretion anymore. The investors, the executives, the influencers, all of them understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Ethan Harper, CEO of Apex Innovations, valued at $12 billion, was unraveling in real time. Sophia's composure cracked for the first time. She forced a strained laugh, raising her voice just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Apologies, everyone, just a little misunderstanding," she said smoothly, though her eyes were frantic, scanning the crowd for allies. But no one moved to support her. They were no longer watching Apex's story, they were watching Ava's. Ava slowly lowered her tray onto a nearby marble side table and folded her hands neatly in front of her. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but carried through the quiet. "Please remove your hand, Mr. Harper." The formality in her tone, the deliberate use of his last name, struck harder than any raised voice could. Ethan released her wrist abruptly, but his arrogance held fast. He straightened his jacket, smirking as though he still believed the room belonged to him. Daniel Sullivan, seated at the far end of the ballroom, set down his glass at last. For the first time that evening, he rose slowly from his chair. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to him. Daniel's presence commanded silence without effort, his reputation carried more weight than any boardroom title Ethan had ever earned. He didn't speak, not yet, but his calm, deliberate movement told everyone the balance of power had shifted. Sophia saw it too and panicked. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering quickly, "That's Daniel Sullivan. You need to apologize. Now." But Ethan, blinded by pride, shook his head dismissively. "I don't apologize to staff," he muttered under his breath, unaware, or unwilling to accept, that he had already crossed a line there would be no coming back from. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder, spreading like sparks across dry grass. "That's Daniel Sullivan's daughter," someone murmured near the back. Another voice, low and urgent, asked, "Are you sure?" The answer came quietly but firmly, positive. Within seconds, the rumor rippled outward, carried from one guest to another until half the ballroom knew what Ethan didn't, that the woman he just humiliated was not just a server, but Daniel Sullivan's adopted daughter. The irony landed like thunder. Ava stood steady, unshaken, while Ethan unknowingly sealed his fate. Around the room, investors adjusted their stances, mentally calculating risk. A Goldman Sachs partner tapped out a message on his phone, signaling his team to freeze any potential funding to Apex. A rival CEO whispered to his assistant, "Sullivan's about to pull the deal." Sophia finally grasped the gravity of the situation, her confidence fracturing beneath her polished veneer. She stepped slightly back from Ethan, as though putting physical distance between herself and the implosion she saw coming. But Ethan remained oblivious, too consumed by his anger to read the room. Noah leaned close to Ava, voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to get you out of here?" Ava shook her head once more. "No," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Ethan's. "I want him to see me standing here." For the first time, Ethan faltered beneath her gaze. He didn't understand why her silence unnerved him, why the power seemed to shift away from him despite his title, his wealth, his reputation. But Ava understood perfectly. Daniel had taught her years ago that in rooms like this, power doesn't belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the person everyone listens to without them having to speak. As Daniel approached, the ballroom fell utterly silent. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks nervously, finally sensing a shift he couldn't name. Daniel reached Ava's side, placing one steady hand on her shoulder, his expression calm but unyielding. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, deliberately, he spoke 5 words that detonated the entire evening. "You just insulted my daughter." The ballroom erupted, not with sound, but with shock. Faces drained of color, investors whispered frantically, and Ethan's smirk froze in place. In that single moment, the $3.5 billion deal was no longer on the table. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. And while Ethan stood frozen, Ava remained perfectly still, dignity intact, control reclaimed. The storm had begun. The rooftop ballroom of the Peninsula Chicago had never been this silent. Daniel Sullivan's words hung heavy in the air, sharp and final. "You just insulted my daughter." No music, no clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, just the sound of hearts pounding beneath designer suits and sequined gowns. Ethan Harper, Apex Innovations' billionaire CEO, stood frozen, his smirk shattered into disbelief as he tried to process what Daniel had just revealed. The servers stopped mid-step, investors leaned forward, and even the jazz ensemble faltered, leaving a single piano note hanging unresolved in the tense air. Ava Thompson stood quietly at Daniel's side, her posture steady, her silence commanding more attention than any outburst could have. She had endured Ethan's words, his arrogance, even his hand gripping her wrist, but now, the truth was out, and the balance of power had shifted so violently that everyone in the room could feel it. Sophia Reynolds, Apex's marketing director, was the first to react. Her perfectly composed face faltered as she turned to Ethan, gripping his arm with sudden urgency. "Ethan," she whispered harshly, low enough for only him to hear, "apologize. Now." But Ethan, blinded by ego and shock, still thought he could control the narrative. He let out a forced laugh, brittle and hollow, attempting to salvage what little dignity he believed he had left. "Daniel, come on," he said, raising his glass with false confidence. "This is just a misunderstanding. We were all having a little fun, right?" Daniel's expression didn't change. He didn't blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deep, and controlled, but it carried the weight of finality. "I came here tonight considering a $3.5 billion acquisition. I came here prepared to trust you with my capital, my influence, and my name. But I don't do business with men who disrespect people, especially my family." The words rippled across the ballroom like an earthquake. Investors, venture capitalists, and industry leaders exchanged glances, whispers erupted in corners, vibrating with disbelief. In the back of the room, a Goldman Sachs partner sent a quick text under the table, "Freeze all Apex funding. Now." Another executive leaned toward her colleague, murmuring, "This just killed the deal." Ethan finally started to sense it, the control he thought he held was slipping, fast, and his instincts shifted from arrogance to panic. He turned back toward Ava, his voice softer now, almost performative. "Look, I didn't mean what I said," he stammered, forcing out words he wasn't used to speaking. "It was out of context. I thought you were," but he stopped himself, realizing too late that any excuse would only dig him deeper. Ava said nothing. She simply met his gaze, calm and unflinching, her silence cutting deeper than any response. Across the ballroom, Noah Carter recorded everything on his phone now, openly, no longer hiding it. He angled the camera just right to capture Ethan's desperate expression, Ava's poise, and Daniel's quiet dominance. Within minutes, that footage would leave this room, and once it hit social media, there would be no containing the fallout. Sophia, reading the shift in energy, pulled back from Ethan slightly. Her loyalty had always been conditional, tied to Apex's power and reputation. But in that moment, she understood Apex had already begun to crumble. She scanned the investors, noting how they whispered among themselves, trading looks, calculating risk. Her instincts screamed one thing: distance herself before the implosion became irreversible. Daniel turned slightly, his voice carrying now to the entire room. "Tonight was supposed to be about partnership," he said steadily, his hand resting gently on Ava's shoulder. "But partnership requires respect. And I've seen all I need to see." With that, he set his glass down on the nearest table, the quiet sound of crystal against marble louder than any argument Ethan could make. It was over. Everyone knew it. The silence broke as phones began buzzing, one after another. Notifications flooded in from X, TikTok, and YouTube as clips from earlier in the night began spreading. Within 10 minutes, hashtags like #ApexScandal and #RespectAva were trending nationally. Screens around the room lit up with headlines forming in real time: "Billionaire CEO humiliates server during gala, but she's investor's daughter." The moment was no longer confined to the Peninsula ballroom, it was spilling into the world, magnified by millions of viewers. Ethan's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, and his face drained of color as he saw the notifications: calls from Apex's board, texts from PR, emails marked urgent in bold red. Sophia caught a glimpse of his screen and knew what it meant. The investors were pulling out, Apex's stock price was already dipping in after-hours trading, and the company's future hung by a thread. Daniel took Ava's hand, ready to leave, but Ethan stepped forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Daniel, wait, don't do this. Apex needs this deal. I can fix this." Daniel turned back slowly, his gaze piercing. "You had every opportunity to fix this, Ethan," he said evenly. "You fix it by treating people with decency. You fix it by respecting the ones who make your success possible. But tonight, you showed me who you are." The words landed like a gavel. Ethan tried to speak, but no sound came out. Around him, Apex's executives avoided eye contact, quietly stepping away. Even Sophia retreated slightly, pulling out her phone to begin her own damage control. She wasn't going to sink with the ship if she could help it. Meanwhile, Ava remained silent, her dignity untouched, her presence commanding in its calm strength. Noah placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, whispering softly, "It's over. You won without saying a word." But Ava wasn't thinking about winning. She was thinking about what Daniel had always taught her: real power isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and controlled. And tonight, the entire room had just witnessed it. As Daniel led Ava toward the exit, cameras followed, flashes illuminating their path. Investors parted silently, watching the Sullivan name walk out and knowing exactly what that meant for Apex's future. By the time they reached the elevator, social media had exploded with clips and commentary. One viral post read, "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just stood there, and the entire empire fell." Back inside the ballroom, Ethan dropped into his chair, his hand shaking slightly as he stared at the untouched glass of wine in front of him. Sophia stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, she leaned down, her voice low and cold. "Congratulations, Ethan," she said. "You just burned a $3.5 billion bridge. And the whole world is watching." Ethan looked up at her, his voice cracking for the first time all night. "Can we recover?" he asked quietly. Sophia didn't answer. She didn't have to. For Ethan Harper, the unraveling had begun, and this was only the beginning. By morning, the world knew. The clip of Ethan Harper's insult at the Peninsula Chicago had exploded across every platform, racking up over 18 million views overnight. Hashtags like #RespectAva, #ApexScandal, and #DignityMatters dominated the trending lists on X, TikTok, and YouTube. Investors panicked, Apex Innovation stock plummeted 18% in after-hours trading, and calls from furious board members flooded Ethan's phone until he shut it off completely. The media storm was relentless, headlines blared, Billionaire CEO insults server, loses $3.5 billion deal, Apex under fire for CEO's conduct, investor Daniel Sullivan walks away, puts reputation above returns. What had started as a private gala became a global reckoning overnight, and Ethan Harper's empire was crumbling beneath the weight of his own arrogance. Inside Sullivan Capital's offices the next morning, the mood was calm but resolute. Daniel sat at the head of the glass-walled boardroom table, flanked by senior partners, while Ava stood quietly beside him, poised but thoughtful. She wore no anger on her face, no bitterness, only quiet strength. When a senior advisor asked whether Daniel wanted to reconsider the Apex acquisition, his response was firm: Sullivan Capital doesn't invest in people who can't respect people. The statement went public within the hour, sending an unmistakable message about values and leadership. Investors applauded the decision, praising Daniel and Ava for taking a stand. Calls from rival firms poured in, eager to step into Apex's abandoned place at Sullivan's negotiation table. Meanwhile, chaos reigned at Apex Innovations. Inside their sleek downtown Chicago headquarters, Ethan's team scrambled to manage the fallout, but the damage was irreversible. Major partners paused contracts, high-profile clients withdrew, and the board called an emergency meeting. For the first time in his career, Ethan faced consequences he couldn't outspend, outmaneuver, or intimidate. He tried to reach Daniel directly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but his calls went unanswered. Sophia Reynolds, sensing the inevitable, quietly began speaking with Apex's competitors about potential transitions. To Ethan, it felt like betrayal. To Sophia, it was survival. 2 days later, Daniel hosted a press conference at Sullivan Capital headquarters. Cameras filled the room, reporters packed the aisles, and millions watched online. Standing at Daniel's side, Ava faced the press for the first time. She didn't speak long, but her words echoed far beyond the room. "Dignity isn't negotiable," she said softly, her voice steady and clear. "How we treat people defines who we are, and last night proved that power without respect isn't power at all." The crowd erupted in applause, and within minutes, the clip went viral. To many, Ava became a symbol of resilience, composure, and quiet strength, a reminder that grace under fire carries more weight than arrogance ever could. Ethan watched that press conference from his penthouse office, his empire unraveling in real time. Board members demanded his resignation, shareholders launched lawsuits, and the PR nightmare deepened with every passing hour. Within a week, Ethan Harper stepped down as CEO of Apex Innovations. Sophia Reynolds publicly distanced herself, claiming she had repeatedly advised Harper to de-escalate, solidifying her survival while leaving him isolated and disgraced. Apex's valuation dropped by nearly $2.1 billion in less than a month. For Ava, however, this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Daniel formally introduced her as the new Director of Ethical Strategy at Sullivan Capital, a role designed to oversee corporate accountability across all future acquisitions. Her first initiative, the Dignity Standard, set new requirements for leadership behavior, workplace equity, and company-wide ethics training. Within weeks, several major firms adopted her framework, and business journals across the country praised Sullivan Capital's forward-thinking reforms. 6 months later, Ava stood on the rooftop balcony of the Peninsula Chicago, the same ballroom where everything began, overlooking Lake Michigan's shimmering horizon. The city skyline glowed beneath the fading sun, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a quiet smile. She hadn't raised her voice that night. She hadn't fought back with anger or bitterness. She had stood with dignity, and dignity had won. Some empires fall loudly. Ethan Harper's fell in silence. And Ava Thompson rose from it, stronger than ever. Thank you for watching this emotional story. If the story surprised you, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next videos. Don't forget to leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to keep bringing you more meaningful and dramatic stories. See you in the next video.